You have a security crisis, you have an energy crisis, and now you have a monetary economic crisis. This is pretty, if you start thinking about that, we're not going to go to sleep tonight. I'm pretty pessimistic about fixing it. My way would be to try and manage it. We need some judicious intervention to curb the biggest excesses. I think the media does have a role.
Halo teman-teman, hari ini kita kedatangan Lionel Barber, mantan pimpinan dari publikasi sangat terkenal yaitu Financial Times. Hi Lionel, thank you so much for coming on to our show.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Gita.
It's been a while since we talked about the world, but before we start talking about the world, I'd like to ask you questions about how you grew up. You were born on the 18th of January, 1955, and tell us, how you grew up and how you got hooked up with journalism.
Well, I grew up in South London in a borough called Battersea. And if you're in London, you drop your T's, so it's called Battersea. And I was the son of, I was a twin. My twin brother was called Stephen, and then a younger brother, Tony, came along 5 years later. My father was a journalist. He came from the north of England, from Leeds in Yorkshire.
Okay.
And he left school, he was barely 15 years old. So he didn't go to university. He was totally self-educated. And I think that was an important driving force in my growing up with my brothers, because we didn't come from a particularly, certainly not a wealthy background, certainly not a privileged background. You could sort of say aspiring middle class, but most important, we wanted to do better. So we were scholarship kids at a very good school that we went to, and then from there went to Oxford University, all three of us.
And when did you exactly join the Financial Times? I know you spent 14, 15 years out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I joined in March 1985, and it's important to say that my father was a journalist as well.
Yeah.
He left school, he worked in a solicitor's office, hated it, and then joined as just a paper boy copy boy in the newsroom, age 17. And he stayed in journalism for at least 55 years. I mean, he just loved journalism. And he also worked for a newspaper in Yorkshire, then went down to London and then joined the BBC, the World Service. And although he had a Yorkshire accent, he was quite well known, and he had a particular interest in British, what had happened to the former British colonies. So he traveled a lot to Africa. He interviewed all the leaders of post-independence, Kenyatta, Nkrumah and others in the 60s. And he also traveled around the world because he was with the World Service. So I suppose he was a bit of a model for me, although he was a tough taskmaster. And although I was worried about following him into journalism, because I wasn't sure whether I could do as well as he did, when I left Oxford and I'd studied German and modern history, I decided that I would go in journalism. So my first job was in Scotland. So I did the right thing and leave England, leave the capital, go out into the region, a nation, Scotland, and that was very good for me.
Did he ever ask you to study journalism, your father?
No, he didn't believe in studying journalism. He thought journalism was something that you actually picked up on, and so he hated media studies, and I'm not very keen on them either. I mean, he was a practitioner. He didn't encourage, he didn't say that I should go into journalism, but I know he was very pleased when I did, and I, because I did quite well, I think he was very proud of as far as I got.
It's quite amazing that you and your siblings actually picked up on wanting to be a journalist. I mean, it's quite rare that everybody of the children, would like to follow what their parents have been doing.
Well, my father was a very strong-willed person, and he always made us read a lot as children. And he had the front room in our house was actually called the library because it had so many books. It wasn't called the living room. It was called the library. And there were hundreds of books there, alongside all the artifacts and things he brought back from Africa on his travels. So it was a very unusual room. And I just remember, it was a bit painful sometimes reading these books. But I think he instilled in us a desire for greater knowledge because that's what had transformed his life. And that was probably one of the reasons that we did follow. My twin brother did write, and he did contribute some newspaper articles, but in the end he went into the city of London and did rather well. My younger brother actually specialized. He worked at Reuters, and then he worked as a foreign correspondent in many different countries. So, yeah, I think it's just a tribute to the force of personality of his father.
Amazing. Now, if to anybody out there that aspires to be a good journalist, such as yourself, you've been saying, to everybody or many people out there to stay curious. And what else do you want to tell them if they want to be a good journalist?
Well, let me stay with curiosity for a moment, because one of the problems these days is people aren't curious enough.
Okay.
They just want to offer opinions. They don't want to delve into the facts. They don't want to try as best you can to establish the truth or the causes of why things happened or what went wrong or what's good about certain things. They're not curious enough because they have preconceived views. But the other piece of advice I would give, and I always said this when I was editor of the Financial Times, if you want to be a good writer, you have to really work at it. And the notion that people can write a very good piece of, say, 800 words in an hour, you've got to be outstanding and very experienced to be able to do that. So I'm a great believer in if you think about sport, that's something you have to really work on your technique. And it takes a lot of time because, to change the metaphor, there are very few Mozarts. Most of us aren't Mozart. We actually have to just graft. And then the other thing I think about journalism is recognize, again, if you're a writer, everybody can be edited. Everybody. There is no piece of work that can't be improved without editing. So if you get 200 words cut off, don't worry about it. Wow.
And let's talk about your days at the FT. I mean, you made a lot of great decisions out there. One of which was to digitize, right? And now we're living in a highly digital world. I want to take you to this digital world where I'm seeing a growing impression that people are equating the amplification of algorithm with democracy in the digital age or digital space, right? And this is manifested in the fact that, social media is unedited, uneditorialized, like the Financial Times would have been. And people are reading, more than 1 billion people, get to write anything without being editorialized, as opposed to the Financial Times, which is a lot less of readership, a lot less of a writership. How do you see this evolving going forward?
Well, let me unpack that just a bit. I think there's some important context. When I became editor and I was 50, I didn't expect to be the editor, but I was working in America. I'd worked in America for more than 10 years. I was a very experienced writer and foreign correspondent. I've been 6 years in Brussels as well. I'd worked in Washington, end of Cold War, then in New York, where I'd worked, running the American operation. And so I came to the job of executive editor with a certain amount of experience, and that does help a lot. And I came to a newspaper, an operation that was in some trouble. We'd lost a lot of money by 2005. And one of the reasons was that we didn't have a sustainable business model. We were overly dependent on print advertising. So It was clear to me, and I'd been in America, I'd gone through the whole internet bubble and stuff, that we needed a new business model that was going to be built around digital transformation, which would fundamentally change working practices, but also shift the balance and dependence on advertising. So we essentially went for a subscription business. Now, all this is relevant to what the question you've asked, which is about algorithms and how they're distorting the way journalism is practiced and what journalism is. So let me try and answer the question. First of all, with newspapers, you had a highly curated process. You had a lot of people in a newsroom. When I was at the Washington Post, for example, in 1985 for a summer, there were 850 people in the newsroom. Can you believe that?
Wow.
When I wrote a piece for the front page on the Washington Post, and Ben Bradley of Watergate fame was the editor, that piece that I wrote was edited by 5 people. Can you imagine? It was so carefully curated. Now, all that, those backstops,
sure,
insurance policies, they've gone. People just kind of put it out there. Even in news organizations, in the hollowed out news organizations in America. In addition, the whole media ecosystem is fragmented because the barriers to entry have disappeared. So anybody can set up a media setup. It doesn't matter. So there's no control. And then, last point, you have a situation where there's no question that this is true. The distributors, the grand distributors, like Facebook, of information / opinion, they're working on algorithms. They're working on algorithms that in Twitter reinforce antagonism, adversity, adversarial information politics. So technology has both liberated, but it's also polarized.
Yeah.
And that, therefore, is a matter for the media groups on how they practice journalism, recognizing that journalism has expanded in a way that it's no longer that highly curated, interface between the public, politicians, etc.
Do you see the prospect of regulatory bodies remedying this going forward? Or do you see more of a case where the regulatory bodies have gotten too co-opted by the commercial instincts, or enterprises rather, to the point where this is probably going to sustain for quite a while before any remedial tendencies can be witnessed?
Well, I think you're going to see selective intervention.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, for example, dealing with hate speech. Certainly the Europeans have done with that.
Right.
So you're not having an absolute guarantee of free speech. Second, how the sort of use of media during elections, that maybe you need to have a quiet period or something like that, where there are some curbs being introduced. I know Facebook is is sort of working with regulators, looking at where may you need some curbs. I mean, remember, this is an aside, but it's important, particularly if you're thinking of your own region, Gita, in Southeast Asia, you think of the Philippines, you think of Myanmar.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, what Facebook was allowing on its, through its channels, was a sinkhole. And while 90% of the debate in America is all about America, nobody thinks about what was happening outside. And it was very, very disturbing if you think, I'm thinking of the Philippines in particular. Maria Ressa, courageous journalist.
Yeah.
So how now? I think when we talk about intervention, that's more likely to happen in America. I'm not sure that they'll be so fussed about what's happening outside. They should be, and there should be pressure. But as you say, these bodies have become so powerful, so ubiquitous. Gallons and trillions of gallons of information and views and whatever spewing out. And now you have the richest man in America, or the second richest man, Elon Musk, taking control of Twitter. Yeah. So there's some real questions. There have always been questions about ownership of media and the practice of media. But, just winding back, when I was a newspaper editor, and I was obviously in charge of the Financial Times when it went through its digital transformation. So we went from, newspapers. This gives you a sense of the transformation and what's happened. When I took over, we had 420,000 newspaper circulation and 76,000 digital. By the time I finished, we had almost 1 million digital subscriptions and 200,000 newspaper.
Let me ask you about Elon Musk with respect to his acquisition of Twitter. Is that net good or net not so good for democracy?
Well, I think there need to be a number. There need to be some serious questions asked. But we don't know. We won't know until we see what he wants to change and how he behaves. The questions. So first of all, to stop the transaction would have been quite difficult,
right?
Because he was offering a very generous amount of money to the shareholders. So then you don't have a fit and proper test for media ownership in America. You do have that in Britain. But, he made a largely cash offer. I can't actually, I think, largely. But it was generous. So it was very difficult to stop it. Yeah. Very, very difficult to stop it. Question now is, given that he is such a ferocious and prodigious tweeter, and he's got into trouble with his tweets, which have been seen as market moving,
right,
and breaking securities laws. He got in trouble. I think he got fined. I'm trying to remember, but certainly he got into trouble for his use of tweets about taking the company Tesla private. If you think that you have somebody who's clearly fluent in the medium, he's the richest man in America, and he's in charge, God knows what the opportunities for abuse are significant. What happens if he starts taking down or ordering any tweet that's critical of himself? On the other hand, right? I think it's pretty clear that Twitter did not evolve as with enough innovation. It is an underutilized, underexploited medium.
Right.
They were very slow, for example, to use moving image. They were just fixated with this 140 character. And then, oh my goodness, it was a big revolution when they moved to 280 characters. this is a medium which can certainly evolve, and let's see what he does.
Is there any credibility in what he's been saying with respect to, he's trying to get rid of the bots, spams, and all those things, and trying to bring people more towards the center as opposed to allowing them to stay on the fringes?
I think there could be, and there's no question, because I'm on Twitter, and for my sins, and I enjoy it. But suddenly I remember at least 2 or 3 times I've been sitting 1 month waiting for my followers to go up, and they've been just constantly being chipped away at, and it's clearly all the bots are being flushed down the water closet. Yeah. So clearly there's been a lot of questions about bots, and I think he will deal with that. By the way, there's another broader point, Gita, that is interesting. There's some massive questions about the legitimacy and credibility of digital advertising.
Right.
I mean, the way in which figures and audience figures have been exaggerated around who's looking at the ads. Big questions about that. It's a bit of a scam, frankly. But so I think that's also part of the bots package.
Yeah. I want to ask you a conceptual question with regards to, I've been raising this a few times in the past with regards to the paradox of democratization of information vis-a-vis democratization of ideas. We have tremendously many more types of disseminating information, but we can't seem to see the creation of ideas in the number that we have seen in the number of the dissemination of information. It seems to be plucked somewhere. And why is it that, the democratization of information has not translated into a proportional, democratization of ideas? We seem to have been seeing polarization of ideas in many places around the world.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons is that we've stopped listening to each other.
Yeah.
And if you talk about the democratization of ideas and liberal democracy, with the rule of law, strong institutions, representative government, then this depends in part on an exchange of ideas, a discourse between others, listening to one another, respecting the right to disagree. All these things are part of the democracy of ideas, so that other ideas can flourish. The theories, both in American literature, the Founding Fathers, Federalist Papers, all this. But we also know, if you read the Federalist Papers, that you can have the mob.
Right.
You can have excessive factionalism, factions. And this is what that wonderful document, which I remember reading first at Oxford, the Federalist Papers, written by Madison J. That in these circumstances, it's easy to see turmoil. Now, what we've got to look at is the democratization of information. What we talked about with the digital revolution is it turbocharges division. It turbocharges the mob. I mean, you can spread information and get people acting as a network to just silence people. I mean, this is what technology has done. And there's no restraint. People are also somewhat, not everyone obviously, but they're not restrained. If you then add to that this notion of the echo chamber where essentially the same people are talking to each other.
Sure.
They're not reaching out beyond their natural constituencies. They're talking to one another and they're reinforcing their prejudices. You can see where you get to a situation, for example, in America, where, the majority of people who vote Republican think that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, even when you have some of his most senior political allies and legal advisors saying it wasn't stolen. People just don't believe it. So that's a long way of answering your question, but I think that we've lost sight of the fundamentals built around the democracy of ideas.
How do we fix it?
Well, I don't know, but I'm pretty pessimistic about fixing it. We're not going to revert to a totalitarian model where we switch everybody off. We're not going to take everybody's mobile phone. My way would be to try and manage it. We need some judicious intervention to curb the biggest excesses. I think the media does have a role here, by the way.
Okay.
I mean, they can't be having their business model skewed to just the most trouble we cause, the most hysterical we get, then we're rewarded for it. That's a very bad position. And then obviously the politicians have a certain responsibility, but you can never ask too much there. I think it's about managing it, not fixing it.
Yeah. Well, we live in an age where, the average person looks at his handphone for 9 hours a day. You think looking at their handphones for 4 hours a day would help depolarize conversations?
Yes, I do.
Right? I mean, that could be practical. I mean, I look at my phone. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've made it a habit not to look at my handphone any more than an hour and a half a day.
Yeah. I'll raise my hand here and say I look at my handphone too much. It is addictive. I remember being in Silicon Valley and listening to one of the executives there just explain how they deliberately made it so it's addictive.
Right.
You always want, you're always on. So that might help. How you enforce it, I don't know whether the phone, shows a blank screen or something. I mean, that's a bit, just supposing you're in the middle of some town you've never been to before and you're trying to find your directions, Google Maps is pretty good. On the other hand, I suppose you could always ask an individual where the way is.
Right.
But that might, I think that's quite an interesting proposition, because clearly 9 hours was ridiculous.
Just the amount of garbage.
Anything over 4 hours a week.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and by the way, the other point is, I won't say who it is, but I've had two young people, CEOs of tech companies, who've said to me without missing a beat that they send their kids to school where no cell phones are allowed.
Yep.
And these are
I agree.
Tech giants.
I agree. Because they know how bad it is. What you're looking at in the handphones. Yeah. Yeah. I want to connect this to some of the points that you've been raising recently. You've been talking about the three, noticeable phenomena. The first one being the rise of populism as a result of a few things, one of which would have been the financial crisis in 2008. And the second being the rise of the East, call it China and India and a few others in Asia. And the rest, the third one being basically how the technological landscape has shifted and somewhat exponentially. Taking on the first point that you've raised, populism, I do believe this is caused by perhaps some of the polarizing conversations that we've just been talking about. But also, it is probably the reason why we've seen sort of a big decline in people's ability to multilateralize in the last few years, right? Multilateralism was the hot thing after the early 90s, and it's sort of like dwindled since a few years ago. It's just been a lot more difficult to multilateralize. How do you see this connecting with each other?
Well, the connection, it can be summed up in two words. I talk about national populism. And that's really the phenomenon that we've seen. The America First, Trump, for example. You have the French populist, Le Pen, it's very nationalistic. German, too. It's against national cooperation. It's a turning within. And it is secondly linked, as you say, the financial crisis legacy, global financial crisis, it was a profound impact because, first of all, again, you've got to be careful about generalizing, and each country is slightly different. But if you think about America, I think one of the key factors here was both on the financial crisis, the way people lost their homes. They believed they're entitled to a home. House prices were supposed to continue to go up. The banks lent on extraordinarily reckless scale through these credit derivatives to supposedly to subprime mortgages, and it exploded. And then a lot of people left homeless. Now, if you put that next to sort of globalization, liberalization of the last 30 years, and you see the way swathes of blue-collar workers lost their jobs, largely as a result of being undercut. Particularly China's rise is important here. Then you can see you've got a whole big populism problem, and that's what's happened. I think last point, you're right that multilateralism. This was a feature of partly through the Cold War and then the end of the Cold War. You had American briefly hegemony, but America was acting in a largely enlightened way, leading coalitions, taking a positive stand in the multilateral trade talk. I mean, we've obviously got unilateral action like on the invasion of Iraq disaster. I'm not saying so there were mistakes and sort of aberrant behavior, but largely America was taking that lead in the multilateral framework, and that's broken down. Right. I mean, nobody thinks you can do a global trade agreement anymore, like in Uruguay. There was an attempt at Doha. Now it's regional trade agreements, if that. So all this is breaking down, and you have a sort of fragmentation. I don't think this means, this is a long answer, but I don't think this necessarily translates into what we call de-globalization. Right. But it does sort of accentuate the blocks and the end of the high watermark of multilateralism.
I agree. I think it's kind of ironic that multilateralism seems to work only when the world order is unipolar. But, when the world order becomes multipolar, multilateralism becomes less easy to implement, as a result of which, regionalization or regionalism kicks in. And that's what we're seeing in at least my part of the world and some other parts of the world.
Indeed. I mean, that links to the rise of the East. I mean, clearly, there are some of the multilateral institutions that we've seen, the order that was set up largely under American direction and leadership after the end of the Second World War, that's having to adapt. Now, some of it is actually getting a new lease of life. So if you think of NATO with the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO is now going to expand. You're going to include formerly neutral, long-time neutral Sweden and Finland, which was also neutral sort of in practice, if not in anyway. So those two will come in. So that's that. But you're seeing as well other new institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, China making it clear that it's not happy with just fitting in to an American-led order, and therefore new groupings, China playing a greater weight. Things are changing.
You mentioned a few things there, one of which is the Ukraine invasion. And I want to try to put this in the context of your famous interview of Vladimir Putin, where he told you a lot of things, I'm sure. But one of the things he told you was that you're not going to be able to drink the champagne if you don't take risk. When you heard that from him, did you anticipate something as dire as we might have seen in Ukraine?
I don't think I anticipated, it would be wrong to say that I anticipated something as outrageous and such a huge gamble as the invasion of Ukraine. Full invasion, i.e. not taking a bite more of territory. But I did leave thinking, and that's why we put it at the top of the article after this 1 hour, 40-minute interview. I thought this is a man who definitely is ready to take risk, who wants a top seat at the table, and also is incredibly embittered, and feeling that Russia hasn't been treated properly and it's time for Russia to come back. And, you can see then, maybe I should have thought more about, well, if you think about what he said about champagne, you think about the Munich speech in 2007, invasion of Georgia, you think about the seizure of Crimea, you think of the intervention in Syria, it's all part of a pattern.
What do you think will happen with what's happening in Ukraine? I
think they're going to fight for quite a long time more. At least months. They may have a brief pause when the weather gets worse, but right now it's a full-scale battle for territory, and both sides, Russia desperately trying to take the whole of Donbass and Luhansk, the two separate so-called breakaway republics, link them to Crimea. I think he's at least put on hold any hope that he originally had. He clearly did have to just topple the regime. And they clearly thought they could knock out Kiev, knock out the leadership, arrest Zelensky, put him on trial, whatever. That Maximus goal is that to, and linking it, by the way, also to Belarus, neighboring Belarus. I think they were defeated in the first 3 weeks. So this is all about control of territory in the east and linking it with the south. From the Ukrainians' point of view, it's inflict as many casualties as possible, try and stop that linkage and sort of bleed Russia to the point where they won't be prepared to come to the negotiating table. And that's when we have a whole set of other questions. But right now, and I've been told this both on both sides from information that I have, that both Putin and Zelensky has made it clear that they have no intention, that it's all about fighting. Everything is about fighting. And it could go on for a long time.
Do you see this potentially escalating to a different nature of war?
Well, there is a risk of escalation. We've just seen this week that the exclave, as it's called, because the territory is not within Russia, it's actually called Kaliningrad, where that's inside Lithuania, or adjacent to Lithuania, and Lithuania standing between Kaliningrad port, that little area, and Russia. This is where the Baltic Fleet of Russia is located, and the Lithuanians imposed what they say is in line with the EU sanctions, the transit of Russian goods to Kaliningrad via Lithuania. That's including steel, God knows what, 35% or so of Russian exports. Now, if it looks like they're trying to starve Kaliningrad, I mean, this could easily escalate.
Wow.
And I think probably it'd be interesting how that plays out. It's one to really watch. I think a lot on the nuclear side, there's a lot of, say, nuclear missile rattling, not the real thing. This was just Putin trying to intimidate. Last comment, I've just come from Riga, Latvia, in the Baltic region.
Right.
And I spent also 4 days in Sweden. If you're there, you're less than 2 hours from Kiev. You feel like you're on the front line. And these countries are extremely nervous about what Russia might do. They are determined that Russia, as they say, cannot win. What that means in terms of a Ukraine victory, well, they say full withdrawal of Russian soldiers. Going to be hard,
right?
But I think you're going to see NATO put more units in the Baltic states. There's plenty of room for escalation. It's a very dangerous situation.
The more this war gets prolonged, economically speaking, the more countries around the world are going to feel the pinch, as we're already seeing with respect to so many commodities prices and recessionary tendencies and stuff.
Yeah.
Where's this going to end? Or what's it going to look?
Well, first of all, you've seen what's happened to the oil price. This is leading to very high or near double-digit inflation in Europe. And Britain, we've got almost 10% inflation. This is the worst inflation we've seen in 30 years. America's a slightly different matter because they've got a giant fiscal stimulus. That's part of the problem, plus COVID shocks as opposed to energy, where they've still got a high oil price, which is hurting consumers, but they've got a sort of slightly different inflation problem. But the risk, of course, is that Europe and America goes into recession because the central banks are now beginning to tighten interest rates, raise interest rates, stop the easy money, accommodative monetary policy that we've had again for the last 15 years. And as I say, there's a real risk of recession. And that will, if you like, be something of a firebreak. It's going to mean a lot of damage, a lot of collateral damage. People are going to suffer. It's an interesting question then. How does this affect Asia? Do you have a certain degree of contagion? And I think on this, you've got to look at what happens to the dollar. Does the dollar go up with interest rates going up? If countries, as happened more than 25 years ago in Southeast Asia with those countries that had dollar-denominated borrowings, they were left high and dry and tremendous crash. Exactly. And then on top of that, you've got zero COVID in China and much slower growth in China. So you have a security crisis, you have an energy crisis, and now you have a monetary economic crisis. This is pretty, if you start thinking about that, we're not going to go to sleep tonight.
Not a pretty picture.
No.
So it's simplistically, it just seems sensible to try to figure out a way to end this war as quickly as possible, right?
Well, I'm nervous about pushing this because we don't want to force President Zelensky to the negotiating table and then sell him out. I mean, we saw this, what happened they sold the Czechs, the British sold the Czechs and the French down the river with Hitler in 1938. Yeah. They essentially gave him Sudetenland, right? which was the German enclave, German speakers in Czechoslovakia. What did he do? Months later, he invaded Poland, Hitler, and then he invaded Russia. So we don't want to be selling Zelensky down the river. We need to bleed Russia. We need to arm Zelensky. We need to stand firm and united. We need to use proper deterrence against Russia and then put the pressure on the Russians. We need to also impose fuller sanctions on energy imports, because right now he's getting billions with the higher energy prices into his coffers to finance the war machine. And we need to just increase the pressure on Putin and make this a bloody and politically expensive war.
And the end game would be a regime change?
In Russia, no, I don't think we should be aiming for regime change in Russia. That's for the Russians. Let's see what happens. Put a lot of pressure on him. If he seems to be failing, maybe something will happen. I think more important is to work on possible areas where, for example, Ukraine is going to be given candidate membership of the European Union this week at the summit in the EU. That's an important statement about Ukraine's Western tilt. Second, I think probably I would not be putting Ukraine in NATO. I don't think that's feasible, not least if the country is territorially divided. I think that they then we need to work on a process of Russian troop withdrawal from Ukraine. So it's a sovereign state, but it's in the EU. But Russia doesn't feel threatened. Right now, that's about the best that we can see. We'll have to see what happens in terms of the way the fighting goes in the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah. You know, you recommended a few books, one of which was The Light That Failed, right?
Yes.
Which I think is a really good book, and is what NATO and the EU are doing sort of like an assertion that liberal democracy has to stand strong in the context of what...
The Light That Failed is the book by Stephen Holmes and Ivan Kostev, who's Bulgarian, which is a kind of critique of how the EU and, to a certain extent, America tried to export their sort of liberal democratic model around the world, and the natural reaction in certain countries. I mean, it starts Poland, Hungary, then moves to Russia, and then China. And it's obviously never going to happen in China. But so that's an interesting critique of what happened after the end of the Cold War until, say, 2015. Now, liberal democracy is under assault, both within and from without. Putin is a menace, and we have to stand strong and united. And that, fortunately, is what people seem to have understood. There needs to be a common resolve. Right.
Let's switch over to China. I want to pick your brains on hear your views on what's happening between China and the U.S. and how you think that will affect not only the world but the rest of Asia.
Well, first of all, we need to understand that we have a different type of leader in Xi Jinping. He's, if not the emperor in Beijing, he's a strong, assertive leader who doesn't believe in biding your time and hiding your strength. In the words of Deng Xiaoping, he wants his third term. That's, again, breaking precedent. And he wants to see himself as a historic figure. And he certainly has an expansive view of China's role, and starting with the Pacific. And he's been a little bit, somewhat more aggressive, sort of assertive on Taiwan, by the way, that's why Ukraine is also important. If the West had just folded, I'm sure that because Xi Jinping would have taken note with regards to Taiwan.
Right.
But if we go back to America, which is where I've watched this evolve, the attitudes evolve. And there's a completely different view of China now. China is the new rival, the new threat. And this is a bipartisan view. It's affected everything, the public debate. And it's seen in terms of China's taken advantage of world trade rules. China's stealing our intellectual property. China is spending massively on its military. It's challenging our position in the Pacific. There's a technology race between US and China. And it's not entirely healthy, but the American sort of political establishment is now rallied. Trump, in other words, Trump was probably right that he was right about one or two things, not many, right. But he was probably right that the American attitude under Obama was a bit passive. I mean, that doesn't mean we get into a complete confrontation, but it does mean negotiating from a certain degree of strength. So the challenge, and this is in the Thucydides Trap book by Graham Allison, is that as the world adjusts to a rising power and a former hegemon, but a clearly dominant power, America, how do these two countries, how do they get on without slipping into a war or conflict? What are the terms of the relationship? And then also, how does this, for America, the challenge is to maintain alliances, not to encircle China, but certainly to project its strength beyond just its own economy and its military, that it's got allies. China doesn't in that same fashion. And that would also have some impact, it seems to me, on Chinese behavior. So I don't think that we're in a period of, it's gone beyond wariness to kind of slight hard-edged competition, but we're not in a hot war. We're in a sort of, again, I don't like analogies like Cold War, but it's a sort of, it's in a very tricky, sensitive period, which will require very clever, very astute diplomacy to make sure that we don't slip into conflict.
Do you see China being able to be revisionist to the global order continuously?
When you mean revisionist, do you mean going backwards to a different age, or do you mean actually trying to overturn it? And
no, not to the extent of overturning it, but amending it so that it looks like it's going to favor.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think a wise America would understand that a degree of amendment and adaptation is probably necessary. But that doesn't mean just say, for example, abandoning half the Pacific, or just turning a blind eye to what China is trying to do to through economic diplomacy. There's been bullying. If you think of the way China's behaved towards Australia, you think of the Philippines, you think of its territorial claims. I mean, all of this it's quite aggressive behavior. And if you do nothing, then in my experience, the Chinese then tend to just carry on until some.
I'm going to ask you the last question. I know you got to go. You have told people that you want to be able to ride the bike when you're 85. That to me tells me that you're an optimist, right? And with the kind of optimism that you project, paint the picture of the world in the next 5 to 10 years. Is it going to get worse first before it gets any better, or you think
it's definitely going to get worse before it gets better? We're in for a very painful, at least a couple of years. adjustment, because we've had sort of very easy money. Everybody's been able to borrow. And then you've got this security crisis, war. I mean, we're in a very dangerous, and we're going to go in through a very painful period for at least 2 or 3 years. The question then is, what is the world that emerges? Is there a new generation of leaders that are capable of tackling the inequality that you and I have just discussed and alluded to?
Right.
Does the West stay united, or does it fracture? Does populism continue to take ground in Europe? And then America. I mean, we have 2024. What's going to happen in that election? I'm just a very old-fashioned person. What happens in America is so important for the rest of the world.
I agree. Can I ask you one more last question?
Yeah.
As a media or former media guy, do you see the media becoming more of a monopoly, or balkanized, or democratized?
No, it's balkanized. You're going to have a few dominant news brands. Right. You know what they are: Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. But you're also going to see a number of new. It's going to be a bit tricky now because the money isn't around the way it was. But you're going to have new forces. The fragmented media landscape that we've talked about gives a lot of opportunities to other players. And that's the other side of fragmentation. So I know there's at least 2 or 3 media ventures that I'm advising on that are just doing niche stuff, and it's valuable. And I think that's a healthy thing.
Hey, Lionel, thank you so much.
Okay, I'm really pleased to do it. I've just got to rush now.
I know. Let me just say one word to the audience. Yeah. Teman-teman, itulah Lionel Barber, pimpinan atau mantan pimpinan dari Financial Times. Terima kasih.